Hey everybody, it's College, Mojian and Ming. So in my last video, I explained that I recently moved to China, and then I kind of opened the comments up and asked you guys if you could submit questions so I can do kind of a response video for a bunch of these questions. And thanks to everyone who responded, and there's a lot of good questions here, and I'm going to go over most of them today, and let's get started. So the first question is a very straightforward question, and it is, what are like my top 5 Chinese weapons? And I gotta be honest, my choices might be a little boring because they're super mainstream, I guess you would say, for weapons. And it is the Dao, for one, to start off, the single-handed Dao or saber. And then I also really like the two-handed Dao, the Shuangshoudao, or what later becomes the Miao Dao. And then in addition to that, of course, I really like the Jian, so the single-handed double-edged sword. And my 4th weapon is gotta be spear. Bing Teacher Wang, so it's the king of all weapons. You can't go wrong choosing that one. And then for the last one is going to be the bow. My choices are pretty boring, but I really like how these 5 weapons are kind of like the mainstay of Chinese weapons. And if you have an army, what you're going to have a lot of is you're going to have a lot of bows, you're going to have a lot of spears, you're going to have some sabers. The next question is about books. A couple people asked me if there are any good English reference works for, Chinese arms and armor. And someone also asked specifically about the Royal Armories has a book which goes over the Chinese arms and armor in their collection. Unfortunately, I haven't seen that book, but aside from that, there aren't really any very good books about Chinese swords. My recommendation is actually to look into 2 other books which are kind of tangentially related, and that is the Met, the Metropolitan Museum, has a book on Tibetan arms and armor. And I can highly recommend that one because there will be quite a bit of overlap between Chinese and Tibetan arms and armor, and that's a really good book. Aside from that, I really like A Study of the Eastern Sword, which is an expensive book. The Met one is free. You can download it online for free, so if you don't have it, definitely go check that out. I'll put a link down in the description below. But A Study of the Eastern Sword is a little more expensive. If you can find a copy, it's nice to have. But it's not, I wouldn't necessarily say that everyone has to have a copy of that because honestly, currently the best resource to learn about these things is just online. I assume that the people who ask these questions already know that the Mandarin Mansion website has a lot of resources. You can find Facebook groups where you can find out a lot of information about, swords and stuff, and, this channel. In the future, hopefully there will be more English publications about this topic because I think I know a couple people who are working on different books. And, I'll be happy to give those my recommendation after I read them. Our next question is there a way to do Kantei for Chinese swords? Now, for those who don't know, Kantei is a formal appreciation of Japanese swords. And what you do is you look at the form of the sword, you look at the metallurgy of the sword, and you look at the hamon, or the temper line of the sword. And then you kind of give, and, you say it's from this school and this style, in China, as far as we know, they didn't have anything nearly as formalized as in Japan. Now, you can definitely find, of course, there were connoisseurs of swords in China who definitely appreciated their swords and they made comments about them, but it's nothing nearly as formalized as in Japan. And I suspect that part of this is mostly due to the fact that in Japan, the sword became an artwork. It was a work of art itself that became very popular for a pretty substantial percentage of the literate population. And if you look at China, there of course there were literati or elite cultured people who did appreciate swords, but it wasn't like Edo period Japan. So in Edo period Japan, all the samurai, they are required by law, or they're allowed by law to carry their 2 swords, but they're not actually using them a whole lot. And they all have this identity as a warrior class. And what do you do whenever you're a warrior and there's no more wars? You basically become bureaucrats, and then you just kind of amp up this image of you being an awesome warrior and talking about swords all the time. So that's what they did. And this situation kind of created this environment where, people became very particular about different style hamons, and like this whole field of Kantei, it really blossomed. And if you look at, the large amount of swords, either in China or in like earlier Japan, many of them were, weapons or tools used by the military. and the military doesn't really encourage or care as much about that type of aspect of sword. So the next question on my channel is, will I talk about Chinese firearms or gunpowder weapons? And what about the use of firearms on horseback? I have thought about doing this before. I'm definitely interested in the topic and I've researched it some. I was actually planning on doing a video about the development of firearms in China some time ago, but this is a question for you guys. So whenever I was making that video, I was thinking about maybe doing a slightly different style of normal videos. Instead of just kind of me here talking, I was thinking about trying to do like a more expanded, in-depth video essay type thing. Let me know in the comments down below if you think that'd be something you'd be interested in, or rather just do what I do now, which is kind of talk at the camera. But yes, I will talk about firearms. And when it comes to the use of firearms on horseback, we know actually that they were using crossbow on horseback sometimes, which seems complicated and hard to do. But there's a lot of interesting stuff going on there. And I think the main thing that people miss when they think about firearms in China or gunpowder weapons in China is that there's a lot of gunpowder weapons that are not guns that are still very useful in warfare. So the next question asks, is there any kind of sword or sword families in China that are kind of dominant in mainstream culture? Like in Japan, you have the katana, and in Europe, you have the long sword. Is there anything like that for China? Now, the jian does occupy a certain cultural role in wuxia literature and earlier presidents. However, in my view, in my reading of Chinese pop culture and kung fu stories and stuff like that, even if you go back to like the Shuangshoudao or the Legend of the Marsh, I actually would take the interpretation that it's not a particular weapon in Chinese literature or Chinese culture that is the dominant sword. I would actually say that the real dominant force in these stories is actually the warrior themselves. Our sixth question on the list is, if I could train in any style or any teacher, what would I train or who would I train under? Now, because it says any style, any teacher, and there was no specification as to time, I would choose to train with, the Qing dynasty imperial bodyguards or the Ling Shi Wei. In addition to that, of course, I would love to train with someone like Cheng Zongyou or Wu Shu, who compiled the Shou Bi Lu. It would be awesome to be able to meet and train with those old masters. However, that's not very realistic because time machines aren't really a thing, unfortunately. Maybe it's for the better. So more realistically, what would I actually prefer to train in? I can't think of any particular masters I'd be dying to train with. There are some pretty good ones. But as far as styles go, I'm at this stage, I have been training in a few things in the past, and I'm kind of in a new area. I'm wanting to find a new place to learn. I can't find exactly what I was doing before. So, I'm pretty interested in in-style bagua or Tongbei Quan. Tongbei Quan is also quite interesting. It's one of the older of the modern styles. And in addition to that, I also think that Hongar looks pretty interesting. So those are kind of three styles that appeal to me some. So there are also a couple questions asking me, will I interview LK Chen on this channel? I can pretty much assure you that at some point I will interview him and I'll have him on the channel. In addition to that, they ask about other people that I might interview and might have some more historians, or maybe historians from China. That's definitely something I'm going to want to look into in the future. I still have a few individuals that I like to interview first and interview some more historians, but I'm also looking at, just having some other, people who do Chinese sword stuff or related to Chinese sword stuff on my channel. And I should have some of that coming up pretty soon, and I'm eager to see what you guys think. Now there's a question about what part of China am I living in and where did I take the image of the thumbnail for my Q&A video. Now, I'm basically living in a region in China known as Jiangnan, and Jiangnan is the lower Yangtze River, and it's a very famous region for porcelain and silk production. And I actually didn't take the thumbnail photo for that video. That thumbnail photo was taken in Suzhou, which is pretty near to where I live, and it's a city in China that's famous for canals. Next question asks, will I go to Longquan at some point? So Longquan is a famous city or region in China that is renowned for sword production for a very long time in Chinese history. They refer to like Longquan Jian. and I would definitely love to go there at some point. Basically, nowadays, if you buy a budget level katana in America on the online, then chances are it's made in a factory in Longquan, because they have entire sword factories there. So it's not just smiths nowadays, it's like entire factories of smiths. And yeah, it'd be awesome to go there, and it's definitely one of the things on my bucket list while I'm here in China. And question number 10. So, will I talk about polearms on this channel, or will I feature masters talking about polearms? And actually, yeah, I would like to talk about polearms a little more. However, if you're interested in the Guandao or the Yuedao or whatever you want to call it, then I highly recommend a different channel, which is Aaron Balavet, who is one of my friends. He's known as the Guandao guy. So you should definitely go. I'll put a link up to his channel on this video. Go check out his channel if you're interested in the Guandao, because there's a lot of good information there. Now there's a question about someone who's interested in buying a Shuangshoudao or a two-handed dao, and they're asking about the options on the market. I'm pretty familiar with a couple of LK Chen's Shuangshoudao. There's the Silver Swallow Miaodao as well as the Changdao. I reviewed the Changdao, and both of those swords are pretty good. The Changdao is quite heavy and beefy. The Miaodao is very light, and it's kind of a 20th century sword design. LK Chen also makes the Crossbowman's Dao, which I'm pretty interested in. I haven't got a chance to handle it yet, so I can't speak to that one personally. Other than LK Chen, because it's like good to get more options. There's the Scott Rodell he designed a cutting Dandao. That one looks pretty good, but I haven't seen it for sale in a while. So you might have to reach out to him and ask him if there's a way to get a hold of it. Other than that, Art of Fire and Iron, they have a few types of Shuangshoudao that look pretty good. However, they are a little bit more expensive. So if you're going to go there, be prepared to spend a little more, but you probably get some pretty nice. So now I've got a question that's common to a lot of people whenever they first start to look at forms in Chinese martial arts, which is what is the purpose of the offhand in form work, and why are they doing all this stuff with their offhand whenever they're swinging a sword around? And this is a great question. There's a lot of answers to it, actually. And I mean, sometimes you're moving your offhand is not actually supposed to be focusing on your offhand, it's actually focusing on your torso and your shoulders. So if you reach out for a cut, you're going to send your hand back because you're actually opening up your shoulders to get more reach forward. So that's kind of, sometimes it's really complicated. However, there's a few things that you see in forms that can, frequently, it can be like, I argue in one of my videos that it's actually representative of a shield. So whenever you have a saber, sometimes you bring your hand out like this. It can mean that you're having a shield there, or you have it out and then you do a jia or overhand thrust over it. I would interpret that to be something connected to shield work. In addition to that, you can also sometimes make a cut and then come in for a grab to their wrist as soon as following up your own cut. And so you get into these grappling applications. And aside from that, if they grab your wrist, you can also do this motion to strip the wrist off of your own hand and then, jab them in the stomach. Very pleasant stuff. And of course, you also have wrapping motions where I make a deflection here and then I grab and I swing around and cut. And you can do that to the other side as well. But basically, sometimes your hand is grabbing things, sometimes it's extending, and sometimes you're putting it against your own wrist, and that could be for extra support because it's a more stable structure, and it also helps align your shoulders and brace yourself against the impact of an oncoming blow. So there's a lot going on there. There's a lot of video material I can make about that stuff, showing some of that stuff, and that's something I'd like to do in the future at some point. So then we have another question from the same viewer who asks, why do Dao from the Song and Qing dynasties become very broad and not have much of a thrusting point, or any? And this is a really complicated question. In the Song dynasty, basically you start to have these quite broad blades. They don't have a lot of thrusting potential. They're basically clipped tips. And we don't know exactly why they're clipped tips, but they mention it in the sources. They talk about making this new type of Dao that's kind of flat on the top. And it might have to do with manufacturing, where it's easy just to have a straight bar and then cut it, and you get two swords out of it, things like that. Because another thing to know about those swords is that they are quite beefy, and I think part of this is to do with durability. So if you have this broad blade, and those blades are not just broad, but they also have a thick spine, so you get a very resilient, strong blade with a lot of weight and mass going behind that edge. And this is because on the battlefield at that time, it was more and more heavy armor was being worn, and you might be using that sword in contact with very heavy objects like whips and maces, iron bars, basically. So in that environment, you need a very strong, robust sword. So in the Song Dynasty, whenever they're really mass producing a bunch of these dao, many of them have kind of a flat or squarish tip, which can't really thrust very well. I made a video about talking about why you would still thrust with a sword that doesn't have a strong point, but that's a different issue. Later on, whenever they're making clipped tip dao, they actually start to do a scoop for the clipped tip. And this means that you actually do still have a sharp point that you can thrust with. Now, following the Song Dynasty, these broad dao with this clipped tip, that actually kind of shifts onto polearms and becomes kind of the mainstay of many Chinese polearm designs for all the way up until the Qing. And then later on, in the Qing Dynasty, you also have the development of the Niuwei Dao. I would also say that the Niuwei Dao is different than the Song Dao because the design of the Niuwei Dao is durable, but I don't think its primary intention is to be durable. I think that the primary intent behind, or the design philosophy behind the Niuwei Dao, is to have a good cleaving blade that can cleave through, thick clothing and stuff like that. And if you look at the design of it, it's pretty broad. It starts to flatten out, and it doesn't have much of a point. And the thing is, if you're fighting in an environment that doesn't have a lot of armor, then you don't actually need much of a point because you can stab people pretty easy. Blunt screwdrivers can easily go into people. So as far as like not having a thrusting tip, I would say the Niuwei Dao definitely does have a thrusting tip, even if it's not as sharp as some other objects like a spear. And the next question is pretty interesting, very complicated. So it asks, will I make videos talking about the Shuangshoujian, or the two-handed Jian manual found in the Wu Beizhi, recorded by Ma Yuanyi. Now, this manual is one that also dates to the Ming dynasty, and it's about using the two-handed double-edged sword. So it's kind of like the Chinese equivalent of the European longsword. That manual is super interesting. I've read over it a couple times. The thing is, I might make some videos at it at some point, but that manual is a lot more vague than some of the other manuals, so it's a little more difficult to work with. And at this stage, I have a bunch of other manuals I'm already looking at trying to work through. Just to explain a little bit about the difficulties of that manual. Basically, in that manual, the language that they use is a little more literary and a little more vague. They don't say things as directly and obvious as many of the other manuals. In addition to that, they don't make a clear reference to an opponent. So they don't explain, in which situations you do exactly which actions. And that can be difficult because sometimes you use that to actually understand what move they want you to do. For example, in the Dandao Fashuan, if Cheng Zhongyu says, when they thrust low, I do this, or this move is used when they thrust low. And then whatever else he says, you know that it's supposed to be countering a low thrust. So that gives you important information to build an interpretation. And in the Shuangshoujian manual, they don't mention that stuff at all. They're just like, this is a move, you kind of do this. And they make references to, a bunch of literary things, and you can kind of get an idea with some of them, but it's a much more subjective interpretation. It's not going to be nearly as, it's going to be much harder to come up with a consensus of what the actual passage means. Another interesting thing about that manual is, in my own interpretation and reading of it, I've looked through it a couple times, I don't think that it actually has any connection to other sources which talk about the use of the Dandao. So in my view, that might suggest that during the late Ming, there were actually at least a couple different styles of, two-handed swordsmanship that existed, which would make sense because China's a big place. And we have a question about shields. So I love shields. This question is, why did Chinese armies continue to make use of shields even whenever firearms had developed and they weren't really stopping bullets? And first thing I should say is that the sources don't say the shields can stop bullets, because they definitely can't. They do say they can stop arrows and resist spears, which is interesting, and I'd like to test that at some point. But they don't stop bullets, so why are they still using shields? For one, the tongue pie becomes really popular with Qi Jiguang whenever he develops his Mandarin Duck Formation, or Yuanyang And the thing about that is that whenever he went to the south to fight against the Wokou, he didn't get the full funding and support of the state. He had to take peasants and make an army out of them. And because of that, he had to use what he had. So he made use of what he had, and the rattan shield was one element of his whole formation that played a vital role in being kind of the front line of defense. However, later on, whenever Qi Guang went up to the north, he got more state backing, and he got to use a lot of firearms. So whenever his second edition of the Qin Xiao Xin Shu, whenever he revised it, he cut out a bunch of stuff that he said, this stuff is useless, let's just focus on guns and spears. So if we take a step back and we think, what did a well-funded army look like in China or in Europe at the end of the 16th century, you're going to get something pretty similar. They're actually going to have a lot of guns, and they're going to have a lot of spears or pikes. However, throughout the rest of Chinese history, including way into the Qing, the supply of firearms was not always able to fulfill the demand for violence, so to speak. So you frequently had all kinds of conflicts between militias, village militias, or people in skirmishes where they didn't have access to firearms. And in those situations, the shield still makes a lot of sense. Additionally, even if you do have firearms and you're pretty well equipped, and like you're the Qing army or something, if you're going to fight a bunch of people who do not have firearms, at some point they're going to close with you and you're going to have to fight in melee combat. So all of a sudden having a shield sounds more useful, even though you might be, have a bunch of guns. Additionally, we also see shield used for naval warfare into the Qing period. And this makes sense because even in Europe, where they got, they developed gun technology much quicker towards the 19th century especially, you still have naval combat involving melee weapons. So like the cutlass is classic 19th century naval weapon. So whenever melee combat is involved, a shield starts to become more logical. So the fact that you have guns doesn't necessarily eliminate the need for shield in all circumstances. Another good history question: what role did the Mongols play in the Qing conquest of China? And this is a super complex question. You could write multiple books on this subject because the thing about the Mongols is that, especially at this time period with the kind of the Northern Yuan and then the fall of the Northern Yuan, the Mongols are not a unified group of people. There's multiple groups in the class of people we call Mongols, and they didn't always get along, and they all had different allegiances to different people. So after the fall of the Northern Yuan dynasty, which the Manchus defeated, the contingent of Mongols actually joined up with the Manchus, and then they continued southward in their fight against the Ming dynasty. So there was an element of both Northern Chinese and Mongols who became bannermen later on with the founding of the Qing because they joined the Manchus before they fully conquered the Ming dynasty. So there's one element of Mongol help or Mongol support of the Qing. However, there are also antagonistic relationships between Manchus and Mongols. So after the founding of the Qing, the Qing dynasty got into quite a few wars with Mongol peoples, and the most famous of them was the Dzungars. So the Dzungars were also founding a large empire to the west of the Qing, and they had a bloody civil war which ended in the genocide of the Dzungar Mongols by the Qing. So there's a lot of complicated history that I don't have time to get into here, but yes, Mongols played an important part in the founding of the Qing. Does Chinese Kung Fu have any direct connections to Southeast Asian martial arts? And honestly, I am not necessarily the right person to answer this question because I'm not someone who knows a whole lot about Southeast Asian martial arts or Southeast Asia in general. It's one of many things that I do not know much about. However, one thing I will say is that whenever you have contact between groups of people, you usually have exchange of ideas, and a lot of the time those ideas also lead into weapons and martial arts. So it would make sense to me if there's some kind of connections, especially with China and Vietnam. If we include Vietnam in your paradigm of Southeast Asia, there's definitely a long shared history, sometimes not a friendly history between China and Vietnam. A lot of weapons and martial arts being shared there. Aside from that, there's a lot of maritime trade with the rest of Southeast Asia, particularly during the Ming dynasty. So I would not be surprised at all to see some connections occurring during that time period. I just don't have the evidence to really support any details about what that might look like. So then there's another question about how long quote-unquote practical Chinese martial arts have been around. And from the context, I'm assuming that the commenter is talking about practical weapon arts. By practical, I'm going to assume you mean things like who actually trains to use their weapons in a live sparring kind of environment, and maybe who also test cuts with weapons. Now, there's starting around the 90s or early 2000s, there's a few different people who, for a variety of different reasons, started to train with weapons more realistically in Chinese martial arts. And I'll just go down a list of a few of them that I know of. I'm of course going to leave out some people, but let's just kind of go down a profile list. So, for one, the one that I'm most connected to, know most about, is Scott Rodell. So, Scott Rodell, in the early 90s or even earlier, he was sparring with wooden weapons at his schools. And in addition to that, he's also really been an advocate for test cutting with, full weight, sharp Chinese swords the whole time. And he's really popularized that in North America and Europe. Another person who I'd say is a prominent figure, if we're thinking about practical Chinese martial arts, would be James Guo. So James Guo is actually an engineer who lives in Canada. And he studied the Shoubi Lu, which is the Ming dynasty, primarily a spirit manual. And he actually created the spear sparring sport of Da Qiang. And Da Qiang is really interesting. I'd like to get into it at some point. But the main thing is that Da Qiang has kind of become more and more popular in both Taiwan as well as the mainland China. So it's quickly becoming one interesting way that Chinese martial artists are, doing live sparring. So another person who's doing quote-unquote practical Chinese martial arts is Lancelot Chan. So he's based in Hong Kong, and he's been cutting with sharp swords for at least a couple decades. And he also makes his own sparring weapons, and he has his own school and his students, and they practice both sparring and test cutting whenever they're studying Chinese weapons. I don't know a whole lot about him and what his system is or anything, but I just know that it's one other place that has been doing this. So a group that I know even less about is the Chinese Historical Martial Arts group based in London. They're also known as Wushan or Martial Mountain. They make their own steel sparring weapons, and they've been using them for a couple decades at least. And something I don't know a whole lot about, but I'd love to learn more about them. Now, another big one that I know about is the Ma family Tongbei Quan, who are based in mainland China. And for over a couple decades, they have been trying to revive and bring back the kind of sport of Duanbing. So Duanbing was an early 20th century Kendo kind of sport that existed in China for a short time. And the Ma family has advocated for bringing this back, and they train it at their own school. So there's kind of a profile list of people that I know of who have been doing practical martial arts for a while. I'm sure I missed quite a few, and there are differences between all these people. They don't always get along. However, one thing that I think that almost all of them share in common is that they don't really like modern wushu form competition and the hegemony, the iron death grip that it has in controlling and promoting Chinese martial arts. So last but not least, we have a question from Aaron Balavet, the Guandao guy himself, and he asks, how do I or people around me, what do we consider to be authentic Chinese martial arts? Now, I'm not going to speak about anyone else at this point. I'll just talk about myself because, that's what I can do. Perhaps in the future, I might, ask other people this question. From my academic background, I know that any attempt to really find a kind of essence of what is authentic Chinese martial arts or real Chinese martial arts is basically going to be impossible because every person has their own subjective interpretation of what defines Chinese martial arts as a concept. It's a very human concept. However, I do think that pretty much everyone would say it has some type of connection to China. So it's connected to the idea of China. Aside from that, in my own practice, because I'm mostly focused on weapons, what I consider authentic or real martial arts would be the training methods that the people in the past who are using swords in real violent encounters, their training methods I would consider to be real martial arts. And if they're in China, then I would consider to be, real Chinese martial arts, so to speak. my own practice of what I do, because I don't actually fight with sharp swords and I don't actually ever want to, harm anyone, I wouldn't call myself a real swordsman because, I don't actually use a real sword against a real sword in a violent encounter. So that's just kind of my definition, though. And I'm sure that other people would have their own. But I wouldn't consider myself an authentic, quote-unquote, Chinese martial artist. All right, everybody. So, those were quite a few questions, and this has turned out to be quite a long video. I hope that you all enjoyed it. If you have any more questions, just feel free to leave them down in the comments below. Thank you all for watching. Please subscribe, and don't forget to stay sharp.